Aboriginal Australians are believed to be the oldest population of humans living outside Africa, having emigrated to the Australian continent from parts of Africa and Asia over 50,000 years ago. They make up one of the two distinct groups of Indigenous people in Australia. The other distinct group is the Torres Strait Islanders. Before the invasion and colonization of Australia by the British in 1788, it is estimated that between 750,000 and 1.25 million Aboriginal Australians lived on the continent. However, the arrival of the Europeans came with doom, devastation, and destruction of the Aboriginals. By 1900, the number of Aboriginal Australians had fallen to just 93,000. Today, they make up just 3% of the Australian population. After wiping out the indigenous population in their thousands from their territories, the British invaders brought deadly diseases like measles, smallpox, and tuberculosis. These indigenous Australians were kept apart from the rest of society, made to give up their traditions, and pressured to accept British customs. Many of them even had their children taken away. The structural obliteration of the Aboriginals reached its height through the policy of protection and assimilation that erased the heritage and history of Aboriginal Australians. This erasure would lead to a pivotal change in the lives of millions of people and have a tremendous impact on the history of Australia. But how did this erasure happen? What has become of the Aboriginal Australians? We shall answer all these questions and more in this episode. Long before the emergence of the Europeans in the Australian continent, there were two distinct groups of Indigenous people of Australia, the Aboriginals and the Torres Strait Islanders. The Aboriginals inhabited the mainland and many offshore islands, while the Torres Strait Islanders came from the islands of Torres Strait, modern-day Queensland, Australia. While some scholars argue that the Aboriginals migrated from Asia, others posit that earlier migrants came from Africa. According to a 2017 genetic study of the genomes of 111 Aboriginal Australians, it was revealed that the present-day Aboriginal Australians are all related to a common ancestor who emerged on the mainland about 50,000 years ago. This is consistent with the claims of scholars who posit that the Aboriginals migrated from Asia. Another theory suggests that the early Aboriginal migrants emerged from Africa and arrived sooner on the continent as early as about 70,000 years ago, thereby making Aboriginal Australians the oldest population of humans living outside of Africa. The continent was home to about 200 to 250 languages and over 500 tribes. This engendered linguistic and cultural diversity as most Aboriginals were multilingual. The Aboriginals had a lifestyle that was based on total kinship with the natural environment. This is often referred to as the dreaming. As hunters and gatherers, several of their acts, such as killing animals for food or building a shelter, were steeped in ritual and spirituality. The Aboriginals were self-sufficient and harmonious. They led a very rich and highly spiritual life. This was largely due to the abundance of resources and a large amount of leisure time available to them. The arrival of the Europeans to the continent in 1788 would, however, bring about a horrendous change to the culture of the people and forever signal a trademark in the history of the Aboriginal Australians. There are no specifics as to the exact date when the Europeans first set foot on the Australian continent. However, an exploration of the continent had taken place long before that time. At the beginning of the 16th century, Portuguese and Dutch ships explored the west coast of Australia. It was not until 1688 that it was officially recorded that English buccaneer and scientific observer William Dampier critically observed the Aboriginals for the first time. Subsequently, English explorer and ship captain Lieutenant James Cook would become known as the official explorer of Australia. He arrived on the east shores of Australia in 1770, almost 100 years later. Cook's expedition to Australia was with the intent to possess the land if uninhabited, or by consent if inhabited. Either way, the land had to be taken under the possession of the British. The explorers recognized almost immediately the commercial potential of the land, especially as a source of commodities like timber or flax. Hence, upon arrival, Cook declared the land, which he called New South Wales, to be the property of Britain's King George III. He ignored vehemently the obvious fact that the land was already populated. Cook declared the land terra nullius, meaning that the continent was a waste and unoccupied. This declaration was largely due to Cook's failure to even attempt to gain the consent of the indigenous people. The Aboriginals put up a fight as they refused to give up their lands. This led to a violent conflict between the Aboriginals and the British settlers, in which up to 20,000 indigenous people lost their lives. By 1778, 8 years after Lieutenant Cook reached Australia, the first English fleet, housing its captain and to-be governor, Arthur Phillips, arrived in Australia. Captain Phillips' mission was to establish a penal colony and take absolute control of Australia for settlement. The invasion of Australia by the British came with devastating effects on the Aboriginals. This distinct group, having been isolated for thousands of years from the diseases that had raged through Europe and Asia, fell prey to the epidemic that ravaged their lands. The presence of the British brought an influx of deadly viruses transmitted by the sailors and convicts. Diseases such as smallpox, syphilis, and influenza dealt a huge blow to the Aboriginal community. Having been isolated for thousands of years, they lacked the immune resistance against these diseases, and over half of the indigenous population fell to their death. The arrival of the British would not only cost the Aboriginals their lives, but also their autonomy and undisputed possession of the continent. There also arose a disruption of the Aboriginal culture, and violence towards the Aboriginals became common practice. The most devastating act against the Aboriginals was the policies of protection and assimilation, which birthed the Stolen Generations. The devastating effects of the presence of the British transcended the destruction of lives to the complete possession of lands owned by the Aboriginals. It also meant a complete erosion of the traditional way of life of the Aboriginals. The European civilization was seen as superior to the traditional way of life of the Aboriginals. While the Aboriginals engaged in the dreaming, which meant that they felt some sort of kinships with their lands, the British engaged in exploitation, oppression, and forceful removal of the Aboriginals from their lands. The clash of cultures led to a constant eruption of violence between both groups, the British invaders and the Aboriginals. Owing to the violence and cruel treatment suffered by the Aboriginals, policies were put in place to protect, quote and unquote, the indigenous sect. The official Aboriginal policy was constituted in the first Aboriginal Protection Act in 1869. This act, which was passed to protect the Aborigines, however, regulated and controlled their lives in terms of the place of residence, their employment, marriage, and even social lives. The Act also established the agency called the Board of Protection of Aborigines. Nevertheless, the policy failed to protect the indigenous people. The second policy put in place was the policy of assimilation, often referred to the Half-Caste Act. By the last quarter of the 19th century, the Aboriginal Australians were considered a dying race, and their culture was defined as weak in comparison to the British way of life. However, the reverse was the case towards the end of the century. The Aboriginals were not dying as expected, and there also arose another problem called the half-caste problem. Owing to the spread of the British across the Australian continent, their men started having sexual relationships with the Aboriginal women. The consequence of this contact was the birth of children of mixed blood. The population of these children soon increased, and this agitated the British Australians. It would become known as the half-caste problem. This problem constituted a major concern for the British, as they believed that the descendants of a dying race might continue to haunt a white Australia for generations. A solution was needed, and a fast one at that. In 1886, the Half-Caste Act was passed. This act centered on the forceful removal of Aboriginal children from their families by the state and assimilation into the British culture. This strategy was simply to make the state the legal guardian of all children of Aboriginal descent. The belief behind this strategy was that the children had not learnt the traditional way of life of the Aboriginals. Hence, forceful removal of the children meant rescuing them from the traditional, weak, and inferior culture of the Aboriginal Australians. The children who were forcefully removed were below the age of 4. They were sent to a mission, a child welfare institution, or foster homes where they were given out to British families if sufficiently light-skinned. Between 1918 and 1970, the policy of assimilation led to a staggering amount of about 33% of Aboriginal Australian children being forcefully removed from their homes. These children will become known as the stolen generations. They were assimilated into the superior British culture. These children were forbidden from speaking their native languages, and oftentimes their names were changed. This forceful separation of Aboriginal children from their families was carried out under the pretense of a humanitarian concern for the welfare of Indigenous Australians. However, the devastating effects of this forceful removal and eventual destruction of Aboriginal culture and society remain to this day. The Australian Constitution, which came into effect on January 1st, 1901, established the Commonwealth of Australia. At the time, there were only 2 parts that referred to the Indigenous people of Australia. In the first part, the Constitution gave power to make laws with respect to people of any race other than the Aboriginals in any state. In addition, Aboriginal natives were not counted in reckoning with the numbers of people of the Commonwealth. The implication of this is that Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people were not recognized as part of the Australian population. Over time, the Indigenous people of Australia would protest the injustice meted out to them. Protest events such as the Warburton Rangers controversy in 1957, the Yirrkala Bark petitions in 1963, the 1965 Freedom Ride, and the 1966 Wave Hill Walk-Off are significant ones that Indigenous people initiated. These protests would lead to the 1967 referendum. On May 27, 1967, a resounding 90.77% of Australians voted yes, so that the Aboriginals and the Torres Strait Islanders will be counted as part of the population. The referendum is significant in that the constitution was rigged and changes were barely accepted. Hence, this victory led to a concrete belief in the Indigenous people and their fight for the stolen generations. The victory that the Indigenous people had recorded in the 1967 referendum led to a belief that they were being heard and recognized, and that their collective issues as a community were not being swept from the ground. As a result, a cry of concern for the recovery of the stolen generation numbers and their families became a huge deal amongst the Indigenous communities. Several years after the victory of the referendum, the Australian government in 1995 set up the Human Rights and Equal Opportunity Commission to carry out the national inquiry into the separation of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander children from their families. While the nature of the practice, that is, the forceful removal of children from their families, was widespread, mainstream recognition of the experience had only been relatively recent. On May 26, 1997, 2 years after the commission was set up, the Bringing Them Home report was tabled to the Parliament. The report documented extensively the experiences of stolen generation members and the ills of the practice of assimilation. The report also highlighted the many issues the Indigenous communities faced. According to the report, it was estimated that between 1 in 10, possibly as many as 1 in 3 Indigenous children were removed from their families and communities between 1910 and the 1970s. The report would go on to conclude that the forced removal of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander children was a gross violation of human rights and, in fact, a genocide. While the report clearly stated that some things cannot be adequately compensated, the Commission had 54 recommendations in the report. The recommendations were made to redress the impact of removal policies and address ongoing trauma. The recommendations included a National Sorry Day to be held every year and also possible monetary compensations, as well as measures for restitution. The first National Sorry Day, officially known as the National Day of Healing, was held on May 26, 1998, exactly 1 year after the tabling of the Bringing Them Home report to the Parliament. The Bringing Them Home report was crucial to the Aboriginal community, and the documentation of their story, especially via the mainstream media, led to a recognition of the sufferings of the community. After the 1997 Bringing Them Home report, it would take the Australian government another decade to officially apologise to the stolen generations. The formal apology was offered by Prime Minister Kevin Rudd on February 13, 2008 at the Australian Parliament Home. The apology would serve as a milestone step towards reconciliation between Indigenous and non-Indigenous Australians. Also, it served as a major way of making real the experiences of the stolen generations. The catastrophic effects of the policies of protection and assimilation put in place by the Australian government, which led to the stolen generations, remain even to this day. Despite the national apology offered in 2008, only about 3% of Australia's population has Aboriginal heritage. The Australian government never made a treaty with its Aboriginal population, thereby making it the only country in the British Commonwealth not to have ratified a treaty with its Indigenous peoples. Today, Aboriginal Australians constitute only a tiny part of Australia, and the struggle to retain their ancient beliefs and culture continues.